If you are someone that helps with behavioural change, or perhaps you need some strategies yourself to make sure that after having a really good month in January, that the cheese doesn't start calling your name at 8:30 at night. Now, okay, maybe that's just me. Cheese just tastes so good. Today, I'm joined by Bobby Cappuccio, and he's going to be giving us some strategies and tips to help us overcome and navigate that comfort trap. We hope by the end of this podcast, you'll be able to help nudge yourself towards positive change and help you succeed at your personal behavioural goals. Thank you very much, Bobby. It's great to have a chat with you today.
Good to be chatting with you as well. I love the subject matter today, and I think it's a fascinating subject and quite necessary to jump into.
Yeah. Where do you think today's going to go?
I have no idea where today is going to go. I kind of feel like our old days of doing improv. You never know what the scene's about into the second line, but there's a couple of places I hope it goes, and it's unpacking assumptions. Just the title alone, one of the reasons why I love it, is avoiding the comfort trap or of escaping the comfort trap. I would assume if you fell into any sort of trap, you would want to know how to escape it. Probably a good idea. But there's a lot of assumptions around behavior change. And I'm not saying that they're not true, but I think they're highly incomplete. Because a lot of times when you listen to your self-help gurus, they're very clear at saying what the problem is. You know, people seek comfort. You know, I've heard this a million times. They want the reward. They want the outcome, but they don't want to invest in the work necessary to get there. And I'm like, wait a second. That sounds a little bit like human behavior, but that also sounds like the opposite of human behavior. And I think what's missing is we can't identify what the problem is without also being invested in why does that problem emerge? Why does it emerge in the majority of the population? Because they'll also say things like 98% of the people are not willing to do the work, but then you have 2%, and they're making these statistics up on the spot. But there's a little bit of relevance to it. Why? Why so many people? Or what's wrong with the majority of us versus, hold on, what's right with the minority? I think that's a more interesting and constructive question. We also need to take a look at the how. Like, all of us are in the training space in some way, shape, or form, whether it's personal training, whether you're a physio or you do corporate training. There's got to be a strategy and a how attached to the what and the why. Imagine this. Imagine you were a golf instructor and I was like, I want to play golf. And the only problem is I suck at golf because I have very little experience. So I hire you. That makes sense. So far, logical. And you take me out and you're like, all right, well, let me see you swing. My swing's abysmal and I missed the ball by a mile. And you say, well, look, if you want to get better at golf, you got to be willing to work for it. Swing harder. Okay. So now I step back and I take a full on swing. Okay. That was worse. Do it again. You got to work for it. And you're like, listen, you got to be willing to dedicate hours of hard work every single day. If you are truly invested, this is really what you want, you've got to work for it. I'm going to come back in 3 hours. I want you doing nothing but investing hard work in your swing. And if I come back and you haven't been, I'm going to assume you just don't want it badly enough. Well, after 3 sessions of that, what's the chance I'm going to come back for session number 4? You're fundamentally right to a certain degree, but being right and being effective are two totally different things sometimes. It's an ineffective process. How do I get better? What's the process? What am I looking for? What are the root causes of the fact that my swing is abysmal? And how do I incrementally work on getting better by understanding what the process is? What are the habits I need to form? Make sense?
Yeah, what I love about that is obviously I don't have your expertise in behaviour change, but for a lot of the people that are on the call at the moment, they've been through the motor skill application specialist. What we do is try and help someone to engage in movement. It's a behaviour. If I went to golf, I am a bit weird. I don't like being rubbish at something. In fact, I hate it. I want to be good at it pretty quickly. I want to feel like I was successful. I want to feel like I enjoyed it. And I don't mind knowing that I've got work to put in, But if I felt like I was just left and there's no way that I would be able to get good at golf, chances are I would probably give up on it. And so, in a way, there's a similarity in that as a movement specialist, you need to try and find a way of getting that golf swing starting off easy enough that it can be accomplished, that the actual person can have a positive experience through playing golf, and then they might want to come back again. But if we're thinking about behavior, we don't know. If we haven't found out why that person wants to play golf, that's a big part of it. What's in it for them? Why do they want that experience? And what if they never played golf? And then I'm going to be thinking about, well, what else do they have in their environment? You know, maybe to come to play golf, it means that they're going to miss a meeting at work and then they might not get pay rise. Or maybe they've got a family, pressures. So actually going to play golf is going to be quite self-indulgent. And so I sometimes think that we think on a rational level, well, go practice golf. That's how you're going to get better, right? And that's common sense.
There's a lot you're saying there. There's a lot to unpack. The two things that I'm zeroing in on right now that are critically important is the conversation around intrinsic motivation and then ambivalence. So organizational development experts, Lisa Leahy and Bob Keegan, they have an interesting process in a way that they look at what drives behaviors and what drives the behaviors we don't want with inside an organization. And there are things that we say we want to do. So, I want to drive numbers. I got to hit budget at the end of the month, or, I want to lose, 1 stone within a certain amount of time. And then if you imagine it like columns, in the second column, and this is something that trainers particularly, but anybody can relate to, there are things we explicitly do or fail to do that stop us from filling that verbal commitment. And usually the assumption is you're not committed enough to the thing that you say you really want. They take a completely opposite perspective. Keegan and Leahy view it as you're extremely committed to something that you are not consciously aware of, or you're not vulnerable enough with yourself and others to admit in public. There's a hidden commitment. And that's what you're talking about. I love how you use the term self-indulgence, because this comes up. I work in the public sector, and people are like, God, how can I invest in myself? And especially the word self-care. The word self-care seems to irritate a lot of people. It's like, I have a family, I have responsibilities. Self-care is, as you said, self-indulgent. And it seems to be this divide between, yes, I want more resilience. Yes, I want to decrease stress. Yes, I want to be more energized. Yes, I might want to change some aspect of my physicality so it impacts my experience of the world that I'm living in. But at the same time, I want to see myself as a caregiver. I want to see myself as someone who's conscientious towards the needs of others. And it's that ambivalence. How do you resolve that ambivalence? And I think there was something else you said in there. You got to get very clear on the why, and we talk about that a lot. But I think the why goes deeper than just, okay, what happens when I've changed this thing? What's different about the world? I think it goes down into, what do you truly value? Where do you find meaning? What are the environments that elicit that meaning? What are the people within that? And how is what you're doing impacting that? How do you get to live a life of meaning through the goal that you're setting or the outcome that you say that's important to you? And then, okay, where do we start? What's the one thing? So the more times you have specificity and clarity, the more variables that start to emerge around behavior change. And that doesn't create complexity, it mitigates it, because I could focus on one variable, or when something doesn't work out very well, which is inevitable. Anytime you start on any journey, there's things that you just can't predict. There's things you're not going to be good at. And that's not like an imposter syndrome. That's life. But if I can dissect a particular variable, it's kind of like this. My wife had surgery about a week ago, and it's quite an ordeal. And she's on a series of medications. And at each time of the day after the surgery, she has to take a specific medication. So let's say I thought, I've got a great idea. Let me bring her all of her medications all at once. Here, take this. An hour later, I'm going to get one or two outcomes. She's going to go, I feel better. Oh, wow, fantastic. The medication worked. Did it? Which medication? I have no idea what worked or why. I'm completely confused. And I've probably over medicated my wife, which is a horrible thing to do. And so the second thing is maybe she feels worse. I don't know why she feels worse. There's too many variables all at once. She's not able to deconstruct any of them. But if I bring her one medication at a time, and this is just an analogy, it's not a conversation about medication, it's about variables. And she's like, oh, wow, you know what? My pain did decrease by about 50%. I know that medication worked. Same thing. What is the one thing that we can do? And if something goes wrong, it's not everything failed. It's one variable failed. And that gives me information that makes behavior change more, not less sustainable over the long term.
Again, what you just said there is a lot to go even deeper on, because talking about the different variables, and that is one of the things, isn't it? The different mechanisms of why something might influence the other. And, one of the things that we talk about within movement behaviors is that we are a dynamic system. And although a lot of the time in the fitness industry, we hear people talking about the biomechanics is, and yes, it's very, very important to know your biomechanics. Is that a word? Your
biomechanics.
Biomechanics from now on.
It's like people who are manic, but in a couple of different ways.
Just like me. So, yeah, so your biomechanics, the nuts and bolts, the car, but then you've got the brain. And, if you did have a car, if we were just biomechanics, it's not going anywhere unless there's a driver and the engine's switched on. But in the same light, it's going to drive according to the environment, hopefully on a road and just not off the side street or something. And so with movement, you've got that interaction between the body, the biomechanics, the brain, the environment, and the task at hand. And all of those are interplaying the whole time. And so within movement behavior, we might want to encourage someone to find their best movement, or the movement that's going to be more helpful to them. And we might use a variable of, can you reach forward and touch this cone? And they may choose to touch their cone with their head. And we're like, yeah, that's not really what I was expecting. I thought you were going to get your hand and touch the cone. And so we then might want to be more specific with the variable that we're using. When it comes to creating that behavior change, like with Amy, it could be the medication, or it could be that her mechanism believed in the medication, so the placebo of the medication influenced how she felt. So how do we know? It's really difficult to know what is influencing it.
Let me introduce this, because that's a really big question. With all these variables, how do you know? So a long time ago, there's a story that there was a physicist standing in front of an auditorium, and this was a world-renowned physicist, and his audience was captivated. They traveled far to see him because he was renowned for his brilliance, and he's explaining about how gravity is a distortion in the fabric of space and time, and because of that, basically the moon is rotating around the earth, and the earth rotates around the sun, and the solar system are basically revolving around the entire galaxy. And he's really getting into this explanation. And out of nowhere, this old lady stands up and screams out in the middle of the auditorium, "Professor, fascinating explanation. It's completely rubbish." And the audience is a little bit aghast and like in shock. Astonishing she would do this, but not the professor. Professor had this kind of cheeky smile on his face. He's curious. He wants to see what this is all about and where's it going to go. And he says, "Well, okay then, madam. So tell me, like, what does support the earth?" And she says, "Well, everybody knows that the earth is resting on the back of a turtle." And this amused the professor. I said, okay, well, what's that turtle resting on then? She said, well, on the back of another turtle right underneath it. And he said, okay, and what's supporting that turtle? And she said, oh, professor, don't you know it's turtles all the way down? And the audience burst out into laughter because this is the most absurd, if not charmingly naive thing they've ever heard. And the professor's laughing as well, but he's laughing for a very different reason because he knows when it comes to the world, obviously, it's not resting on the back of the turtle. But when it comes to a metaphor of our world, she's absolutely right. It truly is turtles all the way down. There are so many variables that influence our behavior, how we interpret events and how we use those interpretations to make predictions, our expectations about the future. So what do you do when it's turtles all the way down? And I think really great advice comes from Edward Deci and Robert Sapolsky. And Robert Sapolsky says it's complicated and you better think real hard and be real careful before you assume you know what a behavior means, especially, he goes on to add, if you have negative connotations about that behavior. I think that's brilliant. Start with it's complicated and most of your assumptions are wrong. DC talks about intrinsic motivation, and there's many levels and forms of motivation, but at the deepest, when we do something because it's innately rewarding, the payoff is in the process, and that's the most sustainable form of motivation. There's autonomy, there's relatedness, there's the continual pursuit of mastery. And in order to have that, we need to be clear. There's got to be clarity. So the more clear we are about what we're expecting, the more we can discern. It's almost like the old knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance. You start out with knowledge of results, and then you give a couple of cues, and somebody, let's say, goes and does a lunge. And if you know exactly what it is you're looking for, knowing that you're never going to see a perfect lunge in any human being, but you know the structure, the points within the kinetic chain that you're observing, okay, well, that's a deviation from. Deviation doesn't mean good or bad, but I'm really clear now. And not only am I clear, but I can give somebody else clarity as well. And it relates back to goal setting. So the goals and the behaviors that you want to see outside of the gym, it starts with clarity and experimentation. It's almost like a form of play. It's not pass or fail. It's like, let's see what happens. And if we have a result, we can interpret it. We can interpret it with the client. We can extract where it's relevant, and we can take the very next step and see what happens there. Mm-hmm. I think that's an important distinction.
I'm glad you clarified that that was a lunge. I thought you said lunch at first.
Well, I mean, how many of us have been very confused and like I've been totally bewildered in a hawker center until I decided ahead of time. So even when it comes to lunch, yeah, got to be clear.
With that, you know, if you say take somebody who smokes, mm-hmm. and they've decided they want to give up smoking, and we know that when people have the knowledge of knowing that this is bad for me, that's not a great way of actually encouraging them to stop. And there's been reports of speaking to people that smoke that are on low income, but they can still find money for cigarettes. And then you think, well, you know, that seems irrational because they, one, know that it's not going to be good for their health. They've got the knowledge of knowing that it's not good for their health. But then they've been reported to say things like, well, in my day, it's the only time that I get when I'm on my own or have a moment to myself. So that becomes a rational reason to do something, that they may have that intention, is what I'm saying, that, mm-hmm. you know, they've agreed that yes, and that they've come in and they've said, oh, I want to be able to do this. And something that I love about what you do is you talk about meeting the person where they are without being judgmental on a behavior and letting them explore that intention.
What the literature says is a lot of the ways that we approach facilitating behavior change is in itself the greatest barrier to behavior change. So let's take an example of that cigarette. The more we try to utilize rationalizations, the more we try to structure and tell people, first of all, telling someone that smoking is bad for them is trying to explain why water is wet. Like, no shit, really. Like, they don't know this. Why would they have any ambivalence about smoking if they didn't have this conversation inside their own head every day to begin with? Right? You wouldn't be having a conversation about smoking cessation because there would be no need to stop something that I enjoy and there's no negative consequences. Why would I? So that level of ambivalence is already present. But the more I start to double down on controlling this behavior because it's logical or because there's a scientific rationale or because of character or I moralize, the greater the likelihood that they're going to sustain that behavior. So it's almost like if you want to, if someone's smoking and you don't want them to stop, constantly talk to them about quitting smoking, constantly tell them how bad it is, constantly tell them how bad of a person they are, how selfish they are, how it disturbs everyone around them. And you'll likely have a lifelong smoker.
Yeah.
You got to, because it's not the cigarette, is it? It was the motivation, and physiologically, yeah, it is the cigarette after a while, but that wasn't why they started. And there's deeper psychological reasons beyond addiction to nicotine why they keep smoking. What is it they're getting out of smoking? That's important.
Yeah. Yeah, a friend of mine, she just said that it was the one thing that made her feel like a young rebel again. And she relished that feeling of sneaking outside when her husband didn't know, and that her
Mhm.
kids were in bed and she was doing something really naughty. And, and that was
Yeah.
spark. But when you were talking, it reminded me of my dad when he was going through chemo, and he was supposed to keep his arm still. And the whole time he's doing this and he's telling my mum, Lynn, go and tell them to tidy up, and she keeps saying, John, keep your arms still, keep your arms still. And of course, that made him want to move his arms more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And just changing that tactic of asking him to focus on his arm completely changed everything.
This is kind of why empathy is probably out of all attributes one of the greatest prerequisites for facilitating behavior change, the ability to imaginably project ourselves into the thoughts, situations, and behaviors of another person and come alongside of them. An executive for Harley Davidson was asked about what it is that they sell. And this is someone who worked straight in the organization and said, we don't sell motorcycles. What we sell is the ability of a 43-year-old accountant to put on leather, drive around small towns on the weekend, and have people be afraid of him. So what we sell is an identity. What we sell is a feeling. What we sell is excitement. What we sell is what people might feel are missing from their lives. So if somebody walks into a showroom, you don't talk to them about how well designed and engineered a Harley Davidson is. They walked into the showroom. They're obviously not the Ducati people. You talk to them about the feeling. You talk to them about the future. Here's something that's important. People only do things to the degree that they feel confident that they could succeed. So if I didn't feel any level of confidence that I could succeed in something, let's call that self-efficacy, why would I ever start? When you start to talk to people about their vision and their future in a behavioral way, not just like what's going to happen, what are you going to achieve, what's going to be different, what are you going to be doing behaviorally day to day, and what's the emotional impact? And out of that, what's most important? Hierarchical. When you do that, that by itself elevates a sense of self-efficacy, the feeling that they are confident in their ability to initiate and perpetuate a series of behaviors in line with the desired outcome. You lower stress hormone levels, you elevate dopamine. So you start to motivate goal seeking behavior. You start to shift their sense of identity and efficacy just in the visioning process alone. But we don't do that very often. Very often, we ask anything about the future. It's so we get information on what to sell you in the moment, not to help you craft a compelling vision that illuminates your highest values and how we can link those values to behaviors for sustainability. And that's kind of the problem. Would it be helpful, I'm wondering, to open this up to questions like now? Because I'm sure people have their wheels turning and they have a specific
Absolutely.
question, 1%.
I've just got one thing to say first, because what you just said there was brilliant. And looking at identities, particularly when we're dealing with things like obesity crisis, knife crime, it's really bad at the moment. And some people, their identification is within a gang with knife crime, and how you can help them to find different identifiers that will build on that positive habit change. What three things could we do to help someone create a habit or an identity that's going to be, I guess it's hard, isn't it? Because it all depends on the person and the goal and what they
It,
want.
it's really hard, but and I don't know if I have. I think if you asked me this question this evening, I'd have. Well, it is this evening for you. I'd have a completely different answer tomorrow. But as of right now, one, getting really clear on what you value and what you want. A lot of times,
Yeah.
helping people craft a vision, or even going into the past. So I remember during the pandemic, people that we know. I was talking to a former colleague of mine, and she was really struggling. She was really having a tough go of it, and this is when she was allowed. You were allowed to sit outside a pub, but you couldn't go in. And she met another mutual friend of ours who was with us the whole time that we were working together in the UK, and he had asked her a brilliant question. Well, you're struggling with all of this right now, and it's obviously painful. But can you remember a time in your life where you were truly happy, where even though that there were challenges and things were imperfect, you felt you really belonged and you were content and you felt inspired? And she said, yeah, when we were all together. And I knew exactly what that meant. And that really hit me. So sometimes if you can't go into the future to find that, go back into the past because we can deconstruct that. Well, what was going on? Well, I had a clear sense of purpose. I knew exactly who I was, what I was doing, what I was contributing every single day. We were all together. There was friendship there. There was laughter there. So there's like a value on social connection. There's a value deeply rooted in contribution. There's a value deeply rooted in laughter and affection. So you could start to deconstruct what people's values are. Now, how do we bridge that gap? In order to get there again, what would need to happen? That's an outcome goal, right? Now, in order to produce that outcome, what would be the behaviors that we would need to engage in on a consistent basis that get your behavioral goals? Focus on one thing. What can I do consistently until it becomes habitual to support my outcome goals, which support my vision of what I'm looking for, which support my highest values? That would be step number one. Identify the values, right? Step number two is what are the consistent behaviors? Three is what is your support system? Your environment and the people around you are enormously powerful in driving behaviors and shaping your sense of identity. Who can you bring along with you? What group can you join? This is why in 20 years, and this is not me being critical, in 20, 30 years, Bob can probably weigh in on this. Every 6 months, somebody came out with a product or a process that was going to revolutionize, the health and fitness industry. This is going to change everything. And it was great. But guess what? It didn't.
Yeah.
Had value, didn't revolutionize anything. If there's one thing that has completely reshaped the health and fitness industry in the past few decades, you can make the argument it was the expansion and inclusion of some form of group exercise.
Yeah.
That changed the landscape. Why? Because it was a psychosocial dynamic, and our social environment and those constructs drive sustainability deeply. So we need to look at what are the just like the social determinants of health. What are the social determinants of change? What are the social determinants of fitness?
So it is that combination of physical and psychological. Yeah, I think there was a study. I like the way that it sums up by saying, go back to Taggart like a detective, and rather than looking at the scene crime and then going, actually go back to the person where they were step by step to look at their environment, their support system, their intentions, that sort of backward step. There's so much to it. Shall we get some questions in?
I would love to get some questions in.
So if you're still here with us, it would be amazing if you could put your cameras on now, and then you can join us onto the screen. maybe Bob might have a question. Matt, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Yeah, very
Hey,
interesting.
You want us to raise our hands for questions or
Yes,
observations?
go for it. Go for it.
Okay,
I'm just happy everybody's not sleeping.
Okay, so Robert Joseph, you were talking. I got all my notes,
Oh my days.
But don't worry, I won't cover them all. Okay, so the most profound thing, well, you said a lot of profound things, but the one that triggered me the most goes back to last year at URSA in LA, where URSA made the decision to change the name to Health and Fitness. And when that was said, going to the concept of behavior change, my first response was, that's a great intellectual exercise, but the ability to make that pivot happen is based on emotion. Why was it that we were so locked into the word fitness for so many decades? Here we are post-COVID, where the consumers globally are looking at wellness and health as their major focal point, as opposed to just fitness. Even the folks who were so fitness focused because of COVID became vulnerable emotionally, psychologically, physically, and they wanted to get well and healthy. So yes, okay, the rationale intellectually for URSA, for example, was to make that pivot. But the oil tanker has not changed at all, because what made us so, for lack of a better word, fitness focused, we still have emotional ties to it, which means that we're still focusing on the 20%, fighting over those crumbs, and not being able to support the needs, the wellness and health needs of the 80% plus, which is a major challenge. So what, to your point, is holding us back as a sector, as owners, operators, and as fit pros from not making that behavior shift beyond the intellectualizing, saying we have to do it, but emotionally we're dragging our feet still.
Wow, that is such a great question, Bob. Thank you for that. There's a book that was written by Professor Gary Hamel called Leading the Revolution. And he was talking about organizational change. And there was a beautiful quote in there. And he says, never in all of human history has a revolution ever been started by the monarchy. So you have to ask yourself, who has the greatest emotional attachments and investment in the past? It's the people at the top who have been in the game the longest. I mean, when you think about fitness, if we ask the story, how did you all get into this industry? There would be deeply emotional reasons. Of course, there's logical reasons, but you're not going to hear, well, you know, my dad was a fitness professional and his dad. So it was kind of like the family expectation. No, sorry. That's not it for me. I was a deformed kid struggling with Tourette's, growing up in a very violent neighborhood, and the gym saved my life. It was a refuge, and surprise, surprise, accidentally, I noticed by changing my body, I could change my identity and open up possibilities. I want to help other people do this. I'm probably not going to be the guy who is extremely forward thinking and open, because I have decades of experience in what got me to where I am right now. So that's the reality of it. Where do we start, right? Like how do we turn the tanker around, in your words? I think one place is with semantics. We throw out a lot of words a lot of times. And I'm not just talking about the fitness industry. I'm talking about multiple industries, because we hear it a lot. Like, oh, people are into this. They're into health. So now we're the health and fitness industry. Well, when we say health, what exactly are we talking about? Define health. And I'll use the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization is a big organization. And again, not to be critical, large organizations are not usually known for their nimbleness, but yet they've completely turned that tanker around on how they define health. It used to be, especially in the West, health was the absence of disease. So I wake up in the morning, I look in the mirror, I don't have a lesion on my face. Okay, so far so good. Let's focus on other things. They went on to now say that health is defined as a complete state of emotional, physical, and social well-being. And they made a point to add, it's not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. So what we're talking about is a complete state of physical, emotional, and social well-being. Well, that brings me to the question, what the hell is well-being? What are we talking about? And if there's an organization out there, and I know I'm going on a rant, but you open the door. This is something I'm really passionate about because I work in this space every day. There is arguably no organization who has done more research on well-being and how it shows up and what drives it than Gallup. They have done over 100 million interviews representing 98% of the world's population. So this isn't the definition of well-being in New York, London, Singapore. This is pretty much global. And when I had the opportunity a few months ago to share the stage with a senior consultant at Gallup when we were speaking to a major school district out here, back in the cafeteria before we went on stage, I wanted to ask her a question. I said, with all the research you've done on well-being, how does Gallup define well-being? And her answer it was beautiful. She said, here's well-being. Well-being is everything that is important to you. In other words, everything and everyone you love and your ability to engage with that. It's what you think about most of the time and your experience of living. In other words, what does it feel like? What is it like to be you? That's well-being. That flows from a state of autonomy. That is internally generated, and that needs to be drawn out. The fitness industry, and we're very good at it because coaching is not the answer to everything. Sometimes it's instructing. Sometimes it's teaching. I want and I desperately need. But we're not really good at drawing out. We're not good at identifying and operating off of the client's autonomy. We're usually the source of information. We're the experts. And that is a terrifying bridge to cross if you've built your career on having information that people need and telling people what to do. And I think what's needed, because change does come very slowly until it's extremely rapid. It occurs all at once. I think you need a couple of weirdos in every single industry. I think you need people who 10 years ago were completely unhireable. Like they would walk into your facility for an interview and you're like, this person's a complete and total lunatic. And if by complete and total lunatic, they just robbed a convenience store across the street, no, we don't need any more of those people, but they have wild ideas and they start to talk about things that are outside of the dogma that we've been discussing with ourselves and are so invested in financially and invested in with terms of our identity that, you know, if something is not broken, we need people who want to break it. I think that's what needs to happen. Can I use an example? Because there are things that people talk about in corporate retreats and it's just stupid. It's really stupid. And you hear it all the time. I remember the president of one major health club organization banned the name Steve Jobs from ever being brought up in any example because everybody was talking about Steve Jobs. But the matter of the fact is nobody would have hired Steve Jobs to work in their organization if he had applied. And we talk about Blockbuster Video. Remember those guys? And we talk about Netflix. And you need to be the Netflix. Let me ask you, you are in an industry where you work for Blockbuster and you're an executive and you dominate the field. And there is a large amount, over 10% of your revenue is generated from late fees. And that is the model. How many of us right now listening to this would have been the person to break that model and embrace Netflix? And the answer is probably zero. So I was hoping during the pandemic that there was so much disruption and suffering in the fitness industry. And a lot of people went through stuff that it was extremely painful. And I thought, hopefully after all this, the model of the fitness industry will be so deeply disrupted, we can't go back to it anymore. We can't go back to the mental models that are anchoring us to our financial models, our business models, the membership model. This is painful now, but it might be the thing that transforms and shapes the future of the fitness industry. And Bob, unfortunately, I see it the way you see it. There's a lot. We've changed our language. We have not changed our thinking. There's a lot of buzzwords being thrown around. but it's a lot of the same.
And it goes forward into every aspect. You know, we're in a world where food is in abundance, and you go to the supermarket, and at the checkout, we've got, you know, highly processed foods to, again, nudge a decision that's not the best for us, and an industry that's profiting on quick fixes and not necessarily what people need. Does anybody else have any questions?
I came in late. Do you mind if you can like quickly summarize the beginning?
It's not
The
very
beginning?
easy.
Yeah, human behavior is very complicated, and probably the only specific way forward is understanding autonomy and what is intrinsically important to people, what they value, and where they get innate joy from. So, what is it within the behavior change process where the payoff is in the process, not just the outcome? And what's one specific variable from which you can start and experiment and kind of measure what works and what didn't from a spirit of curiosity and play. I don't know if that summarizes the beginning, but I hope it kind of shapes what we were talking about.
I think for me as well, what's really important is when I started to think about knowledge isn't always the answer, because even with the right information, you know, if you've got a chronic disease, it's not always easy to do the right thing. It might be slightly easier if it's acute disease. Thinking that we're rational, some of us are irrational. Thinking about, well, with regards to weight loss, it's easy, it's simple, it's common sense. It's not. It's not. And understanding the different environments that we're all in, the different pressures, the different experiences we've all had will influence every choice that we make. And I think, particularly from a movement coach perspective, I always want to be there and let my client explore their movement and find their best movement rather than dictate what their movement should be. And I see that within behavior, you know, which you were saying, Bobby, coming from the intention.
No, thank you for that. So I'm one of Joe's clients. I'm not in the fitness industry, but I'm a psychologist actually, and I work a lot in the forensic field. So we do a lot about behaviour change. And one of the models we use quite a lot, which I'm sure you know of, is the COM-B model, which indicates that people need the capability to change. So they need the psychological and physical ability. Then they need the opportunity, so like the resources, the time, the opportunities, and they need the motivation in order to create behavior change. And today you've spoken a lot about the motivation. So in terms of, you know, breaking down things into manageable chunks, rewarding people in the right way, tapping into people's values and so on. But I just wondered, I guess my question was around how that model might apply to the fitness industry, and in particular, how can people tap into those capability and opportunity factors of the model?
Thank you for that question. I don't want to go back into my rants, and I do love the health and fitness industry. I think we've done a lot of good globally, and I think there's things that we need to work on. And one of the things that we really need to do, two things, is suspend assumptions. We believe we know why people do the things they do. And when they don't do the things that they say they want to do, we know the reason for that as well. And the answer is we don't. People like you, Helen, and individuals who have spent their entire lives or their entire adult lives studying human behavior come up with quite different conclusions than the fitness industry. So we have to either assume that there is an underground cult with an agenda and you dress up in hoods and you have weekly meetings. And if you're doing that, pretty cool, actually, no critique, but I doubt that's what's happening. Or maybe what we believe about behavior change is not entirely complete. Second, what about capacity? From a coaching perspective, so, and I know that this is going to be redundant for you, Helen, but I find this useful. There are certain linguistic predictors. There are certain ways that people explain things and communicate that predicts behavior change. And it can be represented in the acronym darn CAT. And everybody's heard the story about there's 3 frogs sitting on a log on a very hot day. One frog thinks to themselves, oh man, I really want to jump in that cool pond. How many frogs are now sitting on the log? And the answer is still 3. Thought about it, wanted to do it, didn't necessarily follow through and jump into the pond, right? So DARN deals with preparation for what's called change talk. What's my desire? What is my ability? What are my reasons for change? And what's my need for change? None of those mean that people are going to change. It means that they're getting ready. Where change is highly predictable, if not imminent, is around the CAT. The CAT acronym stands for commitment, activation, and taking steps. When people start to use languaging around not I want to, but I will, I am ready, speaks to readiness, like in the trans-theoretical model of change. When they, and especially the T, when they already view themselves as having taken a meaningful, relevant action, that's the greatest predictor. And Helen is talking about something that I deal with doing my work in the public sector continually. There is a difference within capabilities. There's a difference within access. We don't acknowledge that enough. As a matter of fact, a lot of our conclusions are impediments to change. But in the coaching space, you would elicit that by asking questions. So identifying what somebody wants to do, what is your ability? Like, what are you able to do? Like a lot of times it's like, I want to work out 3 days a week, but my schedule's completely unpredictable, and you got to pick up the kids and, my spouse's schedule is completely unpredictable. And there's all these variables. I could be called into a meeting. Okay, great. The first step is not denying someone's reality. If somebody says that there is an impediment, framing it as an excuse is not helpful for them, and it's not helpful for us. Accept it as that's real. Okay, so these are all the limiting factors, and maybe even reflect a step further. What's the emotional impact of that? Are you hearing disappointment? Are you hearing resignation? Are you hearing frustration that there's something they know they genuinely want to do and you believe them, and there's something that's getting in the way and thwarting it? Maybe there's a little bit of resentment, right? Reflect back what that means, align with them, and then maybe ask the question, what are you able to do? No matter how small, what is within your locus of control? Or can you tell me about a time in the past where you wanted to do something, but there were a lot of impediments in the way, yet you still found a starting point, and looking back, you did fairly well. What was that like? Tell me that story. A lot of times we can elicit from people what their level of capability is within a given set of circumstances. I think the problem is we usually communicate in all or nothing. If you're serious, you'll do everything or nothing at all. And people feel overwhelmed. Where if we ask rather than telling, a lot of times there's a level of, I'll talk about smoking cessation. So James Petraska is one of the pioneers behind the trans-theoretical model of change, which are the levels or the stages we go through when we're trying to change an aspect of our lives behaviorally. And he uses the example of smoking cessation programs. So let's say you come to me and I own a smoking cessation business. I say, listen, 10% of the people who come to us effectively quit smoking. Well, that's not exactly true, because the only acceptable change in behavior for me in my program is either reducing or quitting smoking altogether. But what I don't look at is all of the exploratory behaviors and mindsets that kind of prepare me for that, where somebody can come in and say, well, you know what? I read an article about someone who quit smoking and all the changes in their life. Or I spoke to a cousin of mine who used to smoke, and wow, you know what? They quit smoking And, I'm just having this conversation with them, and I would be disappointed because that's not behavior change. Did you actually reduce the number of cigarettes you're smoking? Well, that's a fail if you haven't. That's incorrect, because what they're doing is going through vicarious experience. That might be what's within their ability. So in someone's mind, quitting smoking might not be something that they're capable of doing right now. Like Joe was saying, maybe that cigarette, that 5-minute break I get is the only sense of reprieve and space and escapism I have from multiple factors in my environment that are stressing me out to the point where the executive centers of my brain can't possibly wrap its head around planning and executing good decisions within the moment. So maybe it is talking to someone. Maybe what's in my ability is reaching out and just reading resources. Because once I start doing that, and that is recognized and affirmed, I start to feel good about that. That elevates my sense of self-efficacy. And vicarious experience, according to the late, great Albert Bandura, is a highly important predictor and prerequisite for tangible behavior change. So asking those questions and accepting what the answer is, holding a space for your client of unconditional positive regard. If you're telling me this is what you're able to do, let's do this. Let's work within your capability, because not everybody has the same community, environmental, psychological, financial levels of capability. And you might disagree with that or not disagree with that, but that is the result of an enormous amount of research, when duplicated over and over, is finding pretty much the same conclusions. And we might not have control. We might not work within that breadth of space, but we can ask the questions that elicit responses that allow the client to have autonomy and control of what the starting point is, build self-efficacy, and allow the client to expand the scope of his or her commitments over time. That we can do. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I loved that you asked it.
Thank you.
And thanks, Helen. Matt, do you want to take your mic off? You wanted something to say, didn't you? Go for it.
It's fascinating what you're saying, Robert, and I guess it's similar to something that I don't know if you use this or not, Helen, but I work in the mental health industry too, and something we use is referred to as motivational interviewing. And it really just means basically just talking to find out what somebody's positive motivations are for change, what their negative motivation, what the negatives of change, what are maybe the positives of not changing, of staying where they are, and what are the negatives of not changing. So then you get a kind of 360-degree view of what those motivations are, and you're able to explore them, get them out on the table, because sometimes people are not conscious of these things that are taking them back, pulling them back from change, and then maybe able to formulate a way forwards, so you can use it within the framework of CBT, and to set those goals, or set the longer term goals, and then some intermediate achievable goals in the meantime. So it sounds like maybe you're familiar with those things, Robert, and it's a similar kind of approach.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. The collective expertise on this call exceeds mine. And there's a lot of good things that are coming from the participants, and I really appreciate it. One of the questions, I'm sure you get asked this quite a bit. For me, it's such an irritating question, because I don't think I really have a good answer for it most of the time. And it's like, oh, if I could read one book on behavior change, what's the one book that I should read? I don't know. There's so many variables to that. But if I were to take a shot in the dark, like someone had a gun to my head and said, what's the one book? Motivational Interviewing by Rolnick and Miller would probably be it, because it not only deals with eliciting and having the client's own internal rationale identify the discrepancy between what it is they're looking to achieve and their behaviors. It not only allows them to elicit levels of self-efficacy, but it also deals a lot with what gets in the way.
Mm.
That would be, I guess you can encapsulate all of the things that get in the way between our frame colliding with their frame in terms of a writing reflex. And if someone, there have been colleagues of mine that I've read their posts on social media, and I'm like, wow, that's an assumption. Like, how do you know that that is true, especially in a generalized statement about people you don't know? And I have DM'd them and said, hey, it's clear that transformation and growth is something that you really want for people, that you're deeply invested in. Read this book. And I've recommended motivational interviewing. I think it is an extraordinary resource. Just an FYI, going back to Bob the Squary's point, when I come back a year later and follow up, hey, how's that book? Very few, if any, people ever go out and read it. So we're talking about people don't want to do the work. They don't want to grow. They don't want to invest. And we're talking about people who say that their whole business is around change and transformation. But you're not going to read a book that has probably more research and, when measured in long-term adherence, less recidivism than so many other models. What's going on there? What's going on there? Like, what if you let go of your assumptions? Who would you be? Right? Going back to your reference with the decisional balance sheet, right? What are some of the consequences as a fitness professional of us changing? Because, you know, like Maslow said, like when someone's good with a hammer, everything is a nail. If you've had a certain amount of success with certain tools and a certain way of thinking, if you let go of that way of thinking because it brought you to where you are now, but it's not sufficient to bring you further, what happens? Because we let go of that fear and we're open to taking in information like the resource you just recommended, it can open up worlds for us, I believe. Thank you. That was an extraordinary reference.
Thank
I
you.
mean,
Can I
for me, it's just something. Sorry, but it's just something fairly simple that, but you don't have to have a great deal of knowledge to do that. You know, once you're familiar with those techniques, and if you follow up with some of those references, I'll shut up now.
No. Can I
say,
just say one thing on that? I'm so sorry, because I've heard the argument on panels at conferences that coaching takes a very, very long time to develop proficiency in. This is correct. To become really good at motivational interviewing, you're talking about thousands of hours of application. However, the day you have the intention of utilizing motivational interviewing, the day at your most unskilled, but with that shift in attention and mental model that motivational interviewing gives you, you will improve in your level of connection, empathy, the space you hold, and the ability to facilitate change for your client. I just want to make that point.
Could I just add to that as well? One of the things I was going to say is if you could all pop your email addresses in the comments, because I've also got some other research links that might be useful to everybody as well. I just can't multitask that to get my research study out and pop it in. And for me, I've kind of gone down a bit of a wormhole with looking at some of research from Camilla Nord, and it's interesting because she's got me to rethink some of what I was led to believe on motivational interviewing, and it's just quite useful to look at another direction as well, and the possibilities of motivational interviewing giving you some great skills to get people to agree to behavior change, but actually looking at, do they follow through with their intention? And that appears to be where there are some gaps. And this is where, for me, nudging can cross those gaps because it's a strategy that we can use to encourage and help. And I think that the real challenge is what we've kind of talked about today, is there's so many different aspects, and how we can create the right nudge at the right time, whether for one person it might be going back and looking at what preceded that event. How can you become part of a community or a different identity? So you do put your email addresses in, I will send you those links as well. And that would be another book that I highly recommend, and that is The Balanced Brain. She's also quite an incredible speaker, and I think I have a bit of a girl crush. So there's probably a bit of a bias within that. But definitely got me to reconsider what I thought. And I think that the big thing is that there is so much knowledge on this panel, and it's not my area of expertise, but I certainly think there are a lot of areas that we're still exploring, which is kind of quite exciting. Well, I feel like I kept you over time, Bobby. I know you've got a day's work to do.
Oh my goodness, my day's just getting started. This was great. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions, for coming in, hanging out, everybody who is listening to this at the moment.
Thank you so much. I feel like getting... Thank you very much, everybody.
I have a quick question.
Stop the record. Sorry for the moment.
Hold on one second. Recording's still on, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, what's your question? How you doing? Somebody has just a question.
Quick question. Robert, were you the one that came to Idea World in summer 2023? I came to your session. Yeah, I like how you talked about, I really appreciate it because I feel like you were one of the few to talk about that it's not about will and self-discipline to succeed. Didn't you talk about that? That was a session, like you kind of like emphasize that point.
It definitely sounds like something I would go off on. Yeah, it's highly likely that was me.
Yeah, because and I'm really happy because I'm personally tired from the idea and the concept that we need to have self-discipline to succeed, especially in the fitness space. And when I talked about it with my therapist at that time, she said, yes, like the self-discipline is more in the fitness athletic world. The self-regulation is more in the mental health field world. And I really believe that I hope, like I want to be the change that I want to see, but within the fitness space to talk about self-regulation, which is, emotional regulation that you talked about just when I came in, taking care of that part will lead to a better self-discipline. And it's not talked about enough in the mainstream.
Yeah, thank you. Some of the things that frustrate me is if you keep hearing something stated emphatically from someone who is an authority or appears to be an authority, you can't help but have that seep into your operating system and how you view the world. And there's things that people say quite often that sound great. Like, it's not about motivation. It's about discipline. For me, my question is, how do you define both? Like, if motivation, and that there's a lot of different forms of motivation, obviously, but if it's a reason for doing something or behaving in some way, and we could say that's a very generic and broad definition, but why would I ever discipline myself over a period of time when I don't understand what I'm doing or why I'm doing it, what my reasons are? Like that doesn't make any sense when you break it down. Discipline is important and it does matter, but it is finite and it is dependent on multiple other things. And to reduce the behaviors of it's basically a fundamental attribution error, where when I look at somebody saying, I want something like weight loss, but what they do is very different than what they say. What they say they want is weight loss. What they're doing is, well, Haagen-Dazs, which I could relate to. I attach a single definition to a character trait or an attribute that is good. This is admirable, but they lack it. Yet when I'm incongruent in my life, I attach it to something external that's beyond my control. Like I say that I am responsible and I am dependable, and I walk into a critical meeting 25 minutes late. Well, why were you late? Oh, it was the M25. That's why I was late. But when you are sitting down eating ice cream, I don't know, maybe your colleagues lost their job. You know, maybe there's something going on in family and work, and you're trying to elevate your serotonin levels, by synthesizing tryptophan. And so you're eating sugary, fatty foods. I don't know what the reason is. I just say it's a lack of discipline. That's not accurate. That's not fair. And worst of all, it's not constructive. It's the exact process that will probably reinforce the patterns of behavior and thought that reproduce an undesired behavior for the client. So I think we can close on that. I share your concern, and I share your frustration with that. Thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
Thank you, Bobby. I think Peter just wanted to show his face. If anybody does want to have a photo taken and show their face, that would be great. Apparently, I have to just get everybody to.
How's my hair, Joe?
Your hair looks great.
Thank you.
Oh no, that's mine.
I'll trade you.
I'm going to just, if Jeff and Eve want to. Yes, lovely. Not sure if is Eve may come. Okay, are we ready? Those that want to have a photo, I've not missed anyone out. I shall do just do a screen drag. Bobby, where can people find you?
Well, I live in San Diego. My address is, well, okay, that's probably not what you're asking. I'm at robertcapuccio.com, selfhelpantidote.com. I try to avoid social media, which I know is blasphemy and
You're not doing
blasphemy
a
as
good
well.
job of that. You're there.
Yeah. And I'm not there. I'm trying to be there as little as possible, mostly LinkedIn. Like I kind of like what's going on in LinkedIn. I like the conversations there as opposed to other platforms. So LinkedIn would be a good place to find me.
And if anybody wanted to work with you directly, do they just email you?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much availability and resources I have to work with people one-on-one, but I don't know, maybe a conversation is me connecting you to someone who, works within my space. So
brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time.